Welcome to Morbid Moonlight's 3 in 3, which is going to be a new review series where I'm going to be giving you three 3-minute reviews of some stuff that I've been watching lately, and hopefully it'll be a little bit snappier and a bit more to the point. What I want to do is to mix things up a bit and to talk about a wider range of different films. Like in this case, we've got a newer film that's just come out this year, an older one that's come out recently on Blu Ray, and something that's just totally random that I just wanted to talk about simply because of what it is. So I guess we'll start with our newer film, which in this case is The Institute from, of course, 2022. Now, The Institute is the feature debut of an actor turned director called Hamza Zaman, and it's about this couple that really want to have a baby but can't, and so they go out to this really swish kind of experimental fertility clinic place that guarantees they're going to get what they want. They arrive, and they meet the guy in charge, who's this strange doctor, whose behaviour is pretty unorthodox straight away, but they kind of accept that the weird things that they see and that this guy does are all just a part of his unique experimental process. As time goes on, strange things start happening to them, and our couple have got to ask themselves how much they really want that baby and what they're willing to do to get it, because naturally things are way more sinister than they seem, and the Institute itself is hiding all sorts of dark secrets. Now, we don't have the Lifetime channel where I live, but I'm aware of it enough to be able to say that this seems like what I'd think of as a typical Lifetime film. That basically means that it comes across like an extended advert, where everything's lit in this kind of unnaturally bright, shiny way, and the people on screen have got this kind of polished, wooden, stilted quality to them, that no matter how photogenic they might look, when it comes to dialogue, they just don't have what it takes to make things seem that convincing. It's got that super bright, slightly alien quality to it, like we're watching a version of people interacting and speaking to one another that's been made by somebody that's never been around human beings before. I think my main gripe here is that there's just not enough horror on display. I watched this one because I've always kind of liked horror films set in clinics or hospital type settings, and I figured I was going to be getting a kind of creepy, weird medical horror, probably with more of a kind of psychological vibe to it. Instead, I actually needed to pause this about halfway through just to make sure that I was watching the film that I thought I was, and not just some bland generic feel-good drama about a couple coping with the trials of conception, because I was really starting to wonder whether or not this was actually a horror film. There are some horror moments when it comes right down to it, mainly near the very end, but there's at least about 3/4 of The Institute where they're just padding things out with pap. The fact it's not a total cheat means that they could have given you a lot more if they'd developed the horror ideas that are actually there more than they did. But instead, it just comes across as a horror film that doesn't really have the courage of its convictions. Instead, it's actually way more concerned with this weird kind of softcore horniness, which actually took me aback a little bit, because you really don't get much gratuitous sex and nudity in your more kind of mainstream horror films these days. It does come across a bit cheap and sleazy for a film that's this low budget, especially when there's more attention paid to nudity than there is to creating a decent creepy atmosphere. Probably tells you more where the director's interests lie. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing though, but I can't say that it's enough to mean that I'd actually recommend that you watch The Institute, because there's not much going on in terms of story to justify that kind of general raunchiness. It does go to some quite weird places by the end, but this is one of those films that I think you could describe as being more or less instantly forgettable, and it quickly just becomes this kind of bland, toothpaste advert wallpaper that will occasionally throw in a pretty lackluster, semi-horror moment. I didn't really think much of The Institute, so I'm going to come in at a 3.5 out of 10 for this one, which is pretty much about as low as I can get without saying that I really strongly disliked it. There's not much to actually hate, but there's also not much to like. In fact, there's just not much, full stop. Next up, we've got a film that was released I think maybe last month on Blu Ray, courtesy of 101 Films here in the UK, and it's this 2003 Hicksploitation, road horror, gross out comedy hybrid called Monster Man. And I tell you what, this film is painful to sit through. It's got that kind of American Pie era humour in it, where we've got these two guys who are our main characters, who we're pretty much stuck with for large chunks of the film, and they're doing this kind of goofy, crude, gross-out humour that you get in those kind of early 2000s comedies, where everything's just really childish and stupid and just lowest common denominator. If that sounds like your thing, if you like those kind of really crude, early 2000s bodily fluid comedies, but wondered what would happen if they involved knockoff Texas Chainsaw Massacre mutated hillbillies and a monster truck era kind of remix of Steven Spielberg's Jewel, then that's pretty much what you get with Monster Man. It's very hard to figure out just what they were actually going for with this one. It's another film where there's so much comedy in it that it's almost pointless even thinking of it as a horror film. It's not comedy that comes from horrific situations naturally, it's just out and out goofy frat boy comedy for large stretches of the film, with our couple bickering and bantering and farting and pissing. And I know that there is a place for that sort of thing, sure, but there's a reason that I watch loads of horror films, but I tend to stay away from obnoxious early 2000s teen comedies, you know? But the thing that really throws me is that all the comedy stuff is just out and out ridiculous, but then, when it comes to all the horror stuff, it's actually pretty legit, and they actually seem to take most of it seriously, and the actual look of the Monster Man himself, I think's great. I mean, he looks really cool. It's just such a weird combination. Then there's whole chunks of this film that are basically just like Jewel, except with, instead of that really awesome rusty old tank of a lorry that you had with Jewel that's its own character and manages to look scary in itself, you've got a fucking monster truck, which is one of the most ludicrous looking things ever, and it's so cartoonish that it's almost impossible to buy into as a threat. It's such a strange mix of things, but I think that the huge stretches of boneheaded comedy, which at their heart I just don't really find funny, are what actually kills this one for me. It's also weird thinking that this film isn't even 20 years old yet, because it really does seem like a film that's from a completely different era. One that was crude and lowest common denominator and just insanely cartoonishly stupid. I do think that it's absolutely fascinating just as a piece of history, as a total product of its era, but equally mind-boggling to me is why did 101 Films feel the need to release this on Blu-ray? Because this reminds me of the sort of film that you'd pick up in Poundland and still feel as though you've wasted way too much money on. I really didn't care for Monster Man. It's probably, I'd say, a 3 out of 10 for me, mainly because I sort of like the look of the main dude in it, and because there are some weirdly well-staged horror bits, and the gore is actually pretty phenomenal. But the whole vibe of this one just squashes pretty much all the good stuff into just this painful, daft mess. Sometimes films that actually have good elements mixed with total shit annoy me more because they tantalise you by showing you that these people are actually capable of doing good work, but would rather just sit and play around in their own shit instead. I wouldn't be in a hurry to pick this one up if I were you. So we'll round things off here with a film from Thailand, which is about as different from the daft silliness of Monster Man as you can get, and that is, from 2009, a film called The Meat Grinder. Although its original Thai title, I think, was something more along the lines of Human Flesh Noodles, which really doesn't leave a lot to the imagination. So this one's about this very troubled young woman called Boot, who runs like a little restaurant. She's really struggling with poverty, and she's got a whole heap of very dark personal problems. As her situation in life becomes more and more desperate, she eventually descends into homicidal insanity, and she kind of ends up killing people and carving them up to be served in her restaurant as, of course, human flesh noodles. As she's gradually becoming more and more unhinged, we learn about her horrifically tragic backstory through this series of increasingly horrible flashbacks that are scattered throughout the film, which kind of play out almost like Memento, where the backstory is played out backwards, and the film's playing out in these two different timelines. What this means is that as Boot kills more and more people and becomes more psychotic and unhinged as a character, we simultaneously are made to feel more and more sympathetically towards her as we learn that she's basically been horribly abused by pretty much everyone she's ever known for her entire life. And she isn't going around gleefully hacking people up. It's more that she's at such an incredible low that kind of turning to murder and cannibalism is presented to us as being almost like the only path that Boot has open to her. So I think it's safe to say that this is anything but a fun film to watch. It is definitely nasty and grueling and bloody, but it's more than just a gore fest. I think the gore is used for more than just an easy release. It's more about adding to that atmosphere of something that feels brutal and inhuman and cold, where you've got that very desaturated, gritty look to everything. There's almost something that's strangely kind of clinical and detached about it all. The gore, ideally for a film like this, that's more about characters, shouldn't repulse you to the point where you forget the emotional impact of what you're seeing, but I think that sometimes the awful and body parts do end up taking centre stage, where it feels like the filmmakers are struggling against the expectations of a film about this subject matter that demands maybe a certain level of explicit goriness. And it sometimes feels like they have sort of given in by dishing out a few hack and slash gore sequences, which quite often feel like they belong to a cheaper and sleazier film than this one, because in its better moments, the meat grinder has got a lot more to offer than just bottom of the barrel nihilistic splatter. Despite the fact it's got a certain kind of doom and gloom inevitability to it all, it's also got a good few genuine surprises to it, and some haunting and effective psychological moments that are more chilling than any amount of splatter could ever hope to be. But really, I think the biggest problem with the meat grinder is that it's really at the farthest end of emotional masochism, where everything's so grubby and nasty and hopeless and bleak that it does kind of weigh down on you, beyond the point where you can actually empathise with what's going on. It's a film that's definitely been designed to take audiences very much outside of their comfort zones, but it takes a certain kind of resilience to be able to put up with the absolute sense of despair that this film radiates, especially when almost every single character beat is about more and more horrific abuse, brutality and tragedy. Which means that it's kind of hard to out and out recommend The Meat Grinder, because it's honestly about as much fun as sticking your balls into a belt sander. It's very tough to enjoy without feeling a real, genuine sense of despair, but I also think that it could have been a lot more profound and a lot more emotionally resonant than it ultimately was if it had just dialed back a few notches on the level of doom and gloom that we get. That said, it is a well-made film, it more or less does exactly what it sets out to do very well, and I think that it's got a very good performance at its heart, plus a lot of very effective moments. I think as a film, I'd say it's about a 7 out of 10, but for my own personal enjoyment, where I do take into account the fact that it's just such a painfully raw experience, then I'd say it's probably closer to being about a 5 or a 6 out of 10. It's probably worth a watch, but this is definitely the sort of film that's not going to appeal to everybody. There's a very good chance that this one will probably lose you at some point before it's over. So that should finish things up for our first 3 in 3. 3 horror films reviewed, each in, more or less, 3 minutes. Hope you've enjoyed it, stick around because I'm working on some more cool stuff. I'll probably try and do a couple more of these soon. Let me know if you've liked this one or what films you'd like to see me look at in the future. Maybe give us a like, think about subscribing if you're still around, that would be good of you, and we shall see you in the next one.